My name's Danielle Cave and I work in the International Cyber Policy Centre here at ASPI. Thank you so much for joining us for this panel this evening. We're delighted to have Sam, Elsa and Lotus, most of whom have sort of flown in either early this morning or yesterday. And I've also been overseas and flown back, so we're sort of collectively very jet lagged. But it's only one sort of 90 minutes that you guys all have to stay awake and then you can crash out in your various hotels. The three of them just came off a great interview with Stan Grant as well, which was fabulous, and I think that's going out tonight at about 9 o'clock. So we're going to talk today about cyber technology and security issues related to China. And this week, and I think hopefully you've all grabbed a copy each, we published 3 reports by Samantha, Elsa and Lotus. And I'm not going to waste time going over their bios. They're on our website, they're on the inside of the front cover of their reports. And because we have limited time and 3 big reports to cover, and then I want to make sure we have enough time for really good Q&A, we're going to dive straight into it. And I'm going to start with you, Sam. Looking a bit nervous. Your paper, which we published today, is titled China's Social Credit System, Technology-Enhanced Authoritarian Control with Global Consequences. Now, having worked with you very closely on that paper, there are a few things I can think of that are harder to understand in this sort of international security foreign policy space than China's social credit system. I mean, it is so confusing, and I still, every time I read your paper, and I must have read it 30 times now, I learn something new. Can you please explain to us what this system is, and how is it different from the TV series Black Mirror in season 3, where there's that episode about a social credit ranking system in the United States that sort of hangs off this Instagram-style network?
Sure. So the Black Mirror episode isn't accurate, but it's useful because it communicates the idea of social engineering. The idea that you know that a certain behavior will affect your actions, either positive or negatively. But the social credit system is actually a lot more complicated than that. And for the most part, it's about the integration of the collection of big data and using that to shape and monitor behavior. And it's also about the integration of data. The social credit system is also about things like discourse power, which are far more abstract. China's ability to project its voice internationally in global governance. So it's not so much as a rating system as it is a system that involves blacklisting, which is bad, or gray listing, which is kind of bad, or red listing, which is good, for individuals and entities. It's not just that you have information going in. Like the Black Mirror episode would show that you do something and automatically you have a score going up and down, and that's not what happens. It's actually that information is integrated, and then you can be affected more easily because if you're sanctioned under one piece of legislation, that could trigger sanctions on that
Additional
under others.
Sanctions.
Yeah, once you're under once that violation is listed on the credit system.
Okay. Lotus, your paper is titled When the Winner Takes All, Big Data in China and the Battle for Privacy. And it looks at how data is the essential ingredient that feeds into artificial intelligence. And in China is the sort of also the ingredient underpinning a wide-ranging tech and cyber revolution, which in turn supports a whole range of sort of issues: political, social, economic, and public security. And what's really interesting about your paper, it's not a policy paper, it's an issues paper, is that you've gone through dozens and dozens of regulations, policies, guidelines and laws related to data and cyber issues. You've translated these and analysed them and packaged them up in these really neat tables, explaining what they all relate to. We've already received quite a lot of your feedback, particularly from the business community, who are already finding it very useful, and we had some meetings today and from people from a couple of different companies and about a totally separate issue, and I explained your paper and they ran up to sort of stand over there and grabbed a whole bunch of them. So what I want to ask you is, what are the upsides and downsides to China's quite broad, to China's sort of collection of regulations and laws, most of which seem to have come into play in the last 2 years?
Mm-hmm. So for sure, seen a lot of hype and discussion on big data and AI policies. The Chinese case is very interesting because, like you said, it shows how the pros cons of these policies. The pros side is obviously how big data, by using big data analysis, you could actually improve a lot of delivery and use of public goods, such as urban planning. But at the same time, the case of China showcases some of the downside or potential negative consequences how big data technology can affect individuals' lives, such as privacy and sort of data collection, data protection. If you look at Chinese laws and regulations, there's a lot of government policy encouraging the use of big data technology. However, a lot of them are going over to the public security sector. At the meantime, there's not so much regulations on privacy and data protection. So it raises a lot of questions about, in the age of big data, how us as an individual would be able to protect our privacy and how our data is being used by state actors and also industry.
Okay. All right, Elsa, your turn. Your paper also landed today, and like Sam's, it's a policy paper. I reckon, Jerry, do you want us to use the mic for everyone? Okay, sure. And it is titled Technological Entanglement, Cooperation, Competition and the Dual Use Dilemma in Artificial Intelligence. And you and I debated the title of that paper a little bit. And I didn't really want technological entanglement to be in there because I was worried that readers wouldn't know what it was, but you were very convincing and I gave in and you won, which happens a lot. And I've come around to that concept quite a lot because I've read the paper so many times. But I want you to explain to all of us, when it comes to this sort of emerging strategic and AI technology space, particularly related to security and the PLA in China, what do you mean by technological entanglement?
So the phrase technological entanglement was my attempt to grapple with some of the complexities of concurrent competition and cooperation in artificial intelligence, which militaries and governments worldwide are recognizing as a strategic technology that could be critical to future national power. And clearly, particularly given U.S.-China military and strategic competition in emerging technologies, there's a growing competitive element here, but at the same time, at the level of academic research and within the private sector, there's a lot of collaboration and engagement, which can be very positive sum and mutually beneficial. However, for a technology that is inherently dual use, and in a system in which the boundaries between defense and commercial research and between private companies and often their activities in enabling surveillance and social credit and otherwise can be quite opaque. There certainly are some risks. So the paper was an attempt to think about how to balance the risks and benefits of this sort of engagement and cooperation in a highly globalized world in which flows of ideas, tech, and talent are quite international, with companies like Baidu having laboratories in Silicon Valley, Google recently setting up an AI research center in China, a lot of academic collaboration as well, and particularly between Chinese and Australian universities. And I think certainly much of this can be beneficial, and we shouldn't necessarily look at all of it in a negative light. But at the same time, there are clear risks and potential adverse consequences there, both in terms of values as well as costs in terms of tech transfer and national competitiveness going forward.
Sam, one of the most interesting parts of your paper on the social credit system is the examples you give of the system's regulations being used to influence and coerce international businesses to change their processes and behaviours, not just in China, but internationally. Can you run us through a couple of these examples that have occurred over the past 6 months or so?
So the most interesting and most visible example is involving international airlines, where the Chinese government, under a civil aviation credit regulation, a trial regulation, sent letters to numerous international airlines, including Qantas, saying that if you don't change the way that Taiwan is listed on your websites, then that will trigger fines. And the credit regulations were actually written explicitly to implement the social credit plan 2014 to 2020, as well as another piece of another document about implementing social credit. And if the airlines didn't comply, then that would trigger something like $100,000 fine, as well as other fines under other laws. So the United Airlines letter, for instance, said cybersecurity law would be one that the company could be sanctioned under. Interestingly, the increase in cases in recent months coincided with a law on the 1st of January 2018 that became effective, that each company had to update their business license so that it would include a unified social credit code. That code becomes effective that law becomes effective in 2 days for trade unions, NGOs, and other similar entities. So the likelihood of this increasing and the scope of this expanding is also is likely in the next couple of months. Another case that I cited is the Japanese retailer Muji. Their Shanghai branch was fined after made in Taiwan was, I think some of their products said made in Taiwan. And they were fined under advertising law. And that fine was then recorded on a credit system that would also potentially trigger other fines. And those are the two key cases involving companies. But then the other thing I came across in my research was a notification on the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office that said to overseas and ethnic Chinese, which is a very broad definition in the way the CCP defines it, that the civil credit aviation law would also affect them. And knowing that the political uses of the law for airlines, you can imagine that could apply also for individuals. It's, for China, a relatively low risk move because at this moment in time, governments don't have the toolkit to really respond. And the companies have to respond if they want to continue doing business in China. And the regulations that are used cover not just politics, but also regular airline safety. And so it makes it very difficult not to comply.
So Lotus, I think we're almost at the last round. I want to drill into parts of your paper about privacy, because at the end of the day, that was sort of the main theme that was coming out of your paper, was how is this all impacting privacy? So could you explain how big data collection in China and the data-driven technologies that you talk about are impacting the privacy of everyday internet users in China?
For sure. So to answer this question, we would need to look at the kind of a uniqueness of Chinese social media or Chinese app landscape. A lot of Chinese applications, they are sort of built to be a super app. So for example, Tencent's WeChat, which is by now the most popular chat application in China, is not only just a chat application anymore. It includes functions like what Uber does, what Facebook, WhatsApp does. It also starts handling very sensitive personal data, such as visa application. It has also partnered with local government to sort of implement this electronic ID system. So companies are actually getting a lot of personal sensitive data by this Chinese application. So this is like a uniqueness of Chinese application. And secondly, because of the existence of real name registration system, it makes government and also industry very easily or almost effortlessly to profile individual user, even if they said that the data has been anonymized. So this is kind of like a, because the large population and massive data and also the lack of privacy protection, it really puts users, individuals' privacy at risk of exposure and being exploited.
Okay. Elsa, back on artificial intelligence. I feel like I'm not as good as Stan Grant was today. It's really, really hard to jump between three papers. Can you run through the Chinese government's approach to AI and highlight to us which part of the government's strategy and vision we all think that you think that we should all be paying attention to? And also, perhaps you could touch on how this big picture strategy is intertwined with the PLA's approach to civil-military fusion. Just a few easy topics to jump through.
All right. China's ambitions in artificial intelligence to lead the world, to emerge as the premier global innovation center are quite clear. And certainly the advances and the emergence of companies like Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, and iFlyTech as both leading players in the world and as national champions, I think reflects the emergence of a unique model of innovation that's combining a state-driven approach with a market-dominant paradigm in which these companies are being leveraged as a national team, very dynamic in their own right, but also taking the lead in major national innovation platforms and projects, from smart cities to self-driving cars and the application of AI to medicine and smart voice technologies, of companies like Baidu leading national laboratories as well, and in addition to high levels of private sector investment. It's a notable metric, for instance, that as of 2017, Chinese AI startups received more venture capital funding than U.S. AI startups by one estimate. There's also a growing amount of state investment in long-term research and development for artificial intelligence, amounting perhaps to tens of billions and rising, with new funds and new investments announced both at the national level and at the local level. And certainly it remains to be seen how successful this massive drive to lead in AI will be in actuality. There are some reasons for skepticism. Not all Chinese plans and mega projects have achieved the desired results. There even are concerns, and validly so, I'd argue these days, that the sheer amount of money going into AI could at worst cause an AI bubble. And certainly China's facing a number of constraints, including shortfalls of talent for the time being. But I think the Chinese government is very much recognizing the strategic importance of this technology, looking to the long term and starting to build up a foundation to truly become a powerhouse in AI. And I think a critical part of that is a focus on talent, with new educational initiatives and training programs, seeking both to educate and to attract top AI researchers from around the world. So certainly that will be a critical metric to watch going forward. And I think across the board, this integrated approach to indigenous innovation reflects that China is no longer content being a fast follower or relying on tech transfer to advance in science and technology, but rather is trying to become what Xi Jinping has characterized as a science and technology superpower, a pioneer at the forefront of a technology that's seen as critical to China's future economic growth and military capabilities as well. And certainly there are a lot of intersections between these commercial and defense efforts pursuant to a national strategy known as military-civil fusion, a concept with a long history in China, but one that's increasingly becoming more of a reality, with new mechanisms and institutions set in place to coordinate and drive forward these efforts, and also enlisting both academic research and private companies in this endeavor. So a couple of examples there be that Tsinghua University has set up a laboratory focused on national defense technologies geared towards implementing military-civil fusion, and this is China's top university in science and technology. At the same time, Baidu, which is a leading AI company in the world and actually had an AI strategy well before China as a country did, has also become part of a new joint laboratory with a CETC, a key defense conglomerate, where they'll be collaborating on the application of artificial intelligence as well as technologies like big data and cloud computing to military command and control. So certainly when you have top universities and top companies becoming more engaged in a broad, growing number of initiatives, even zones set up nationwide to advance military-civil fusion, I think it's clear that these boundaries between commercial and defense developments will continue to blur going forward as these efforts start to mature.
Sam, last one. So, after reading your paper, it is clear that China's social credit system is this multi-purpose dual-use system, which I guess is normal. A lot of things are multi-purpose. But can you explain to us what the Chinese Communist Party's aims are in implementing this system? So in your paper you talk about it's used to solve problems for social management, for economic management, and for state security. But what I want to know is, if the CCP has to make a choice, which of these wins out above all others at the end of the day?
So the key to understanding the purpose of the social credit system is really in the first line of the plan, which says, not word for word, but it says that social credit is a system that is designed to improve the economic development and the social governance systems. social governance is the same thing as social management, and social management is a concept that dates back to at least the Mao era. And it's something that basically it's the idea of shaping how people and entities behave, and also actually controlling the party itself. It's a preemptive process of ensuring state security. State security in China isn't the same as national security here in Australia. It's also the idea that the party protects itself and that the party expand its power in order to protect its power. And so social credit as a system is designed to solve real problems. But in solving problems, the same mechanisms are also exerting control. So some of the problems that the system addresses are things like food safety and health safety, and both because these are things that any government should be addressing, but also because these are sources of security threats for the Chinese Communist Party. If you think back to food and health safety scandals in the 2000s, things like SARS, things like the milk powder scandal, and so on. And so also part of what the social credit system does is it takes normal economic and social activity and integrates that into control. So then you actually want to participate in your own management. And it should solve problems, but at the same time, if that was the overarching objective, then you wouldn't need something like a social credit system to do it. Normal regulation and better governance should actually address that. You wouldn't need a system that tied everything together. But that is how social management as a concept has worked for a very long time.
Okay. Lotus, a final question for you. Can you take a step back for us and think about the big picture here when it comes to your paper? So what are the international implications, do you think, of China's approach to information control and big data collection? So if you're a company or an entity operating, or an individual, well, a company or a civil society group operating in China, what do all these regulations and policies and guidelines actually mean for you?
Yeah, for sure. So like Sam and Elsa already mentioned, a lot of Chinese policy not only have implication on its domestic population, but it also have international significance and it influence how not only Chinese company, but also foreign companies operating in China. So in the paper, I talk about the case of China's enforcement of cybersecurity law. In it, it specified that so first of all, it specified that foreign company operating in China would now need to localize their data in China. And second of all, when an overseas company, even if you're a foreign entity, when you transfer data outside of China, it would have to go through the security assessment conducted by Cyberspace Administration of China. So it has a lot of implications. It not only incurs the cost of foreign company operating in China, but it also opened up the potential consequences of government having access or monitoring user data, even when these data are generated by a foreign services provider. So a case in point is that Apple has started its China data center, and then it has migrated all the iCloud China data to these data center, which it partners with a government associated big data center. So it's very important to kind of keep track of Chinese direction and the direction the Chinese government want to take in terms of big data or AI area, and to see how this kind of policy would unroll, what consequences would it have in not only domestic but international audiences.
So is that the future then? Companies operating in China having these China data centers in order to operate there?
I believe that's a trend. We're already seeing the effect of cybersecurity law on companies like Amazon and Apple. So I think the trend is going to be more and more evidence in the future.
Okay. Elsa, last question, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. So please think of your questions now for any of our panelists. And they don't have to specifically be on their papers either. Stan Grant asked some pretty good questions about Huawei today, so you're welcome to ask whatever you'd like, as long as there's a sort of security tech or cyber angle. I feel like one of you is going to be able to tackle it. So Elsa, in your paper, and you mentioned this briefly in answering my last question, you talk about the dual-use dilemma and you reference problematic partnerships in your report, and you describe these as entanglements, which, for example, have included ties between US tech firms and Chinese partners with military connections, as well as cooperation between Australian universities and defence state-owned enterprises and the PLA. Could you sort of delve a bit deeper into what these partnerships are in place in Australia and the US and others? You talked about an MIT one actually earlier today. And could you outline why these partnerships are problematic, and then talk us through how governments like Australia should deal with these partnerships, given they're already in existence and some are actually very entrenched across universities around the world and across universities in Australia?
I think certainly there is a tension between the natural tendency towards openness and collaboration in science and innovation, particularly in a democracy, and some of the risks of tech transfer and some of the concerns that arise with dual-use technologies in particular, as we've seen in a number of these cases. So certainly, I'd say in the abstract, I'm in favor of cooperation. I recognize its benefits, but in cases where you've had, for instance, CETC funding research in Australian universities, or collaborations between members of the Chinese military and foreign academics, or I think certainly there are reasons to, at the very least, raise questions and think about what appropriate safeguards should be put in place in these cases. So recently, for instance, MIT set up a new joint laboratory in partnership with iFlyTech, which has been quite closely linked to Chinese government surveillance efforts and otherwise, as some of Lotus's work has shown. So I think certainly there are reasons for concern that even if these collaborations may be entered into in good faith, the unintended consequences could arise when some of the end results of that partnership could be technologies that have clear applications in surveillance or even in national defense going forward. So I think certainly it's at the very least it's something that I think should be academics and those in the business community also entering into these sorts of partnerships, even on something like self-driving cars, where the difference between an autonomous vehicle and a self-driving tank is certainly all comes down to what do you do with it. I think a lot of the basic sensors and systems are comparable, so there's certainly, and this is not unique to AI, but I think it's particularly acute in this case because a lot of innovation is being driven by the commercial sector, both in the US and in China. And you have companies like Baidu that are present in Silicon Valley, very international in their outlook, but also working with the Chinese defense industry on AI as applied to military command and control. So I think certainly there are a range of different examples, and I've proposed quite a few policy recommendations and considerations, 15 or so in total, and I'll hope you all will have a chance to read the paper, as well as Sam's and Lotus's, which are phenomenal. But I'd just say quickly a couple of things to keep in mind. Certainly awareness is at a bare minimum, and I think beyond that, thinking about countermeasures for cases where there have been abuses. So for instance, ensuring that export controls and foreign investment review mechanisms are adjusted where necessary to reflect that often research, even at an early stage, or dual-use commercial technologies can have defense implications in certain instances. I think beyond that, trying to recognize what appropriate safeguards should be in place when there is this sort of collaboration. So for instance, ensuring transparency, committing to certain statements of principles for academic research, or even thinking through questions such as what happens to sensitive data or data sets and how are those handled in cases where data might be used to train AI or could have security implications. So certainly I think given the Chinese government's history of tech transfer through licit and illicit means, and some of the problematic cases that have arisen in Australian media and started to provoke quite a lot of concern in the US as well, with high levels of Chinese investment, highly targeted acquisitions, I think there is a need to both push back when appropriate and also I think above all else, think about how we sustain the dynamism of innovation in the US and Australia, how we revitalize our own innovation ecosystems, and both react defensively where appropriate. For instance, having greater transparency about who is funding academic research and what the outcome of intellectual property is, putting clearer policies in place about academic collaboration with members of foreign militaries or state-owned enterprises. But at the same time, I think going on the offensive and focusing on investing in research and development, educating and attracting talent. A number of the policies that the Chinese government happens to be pursuing these days, I think, are policies that also have a long history in the U.S. and Australia, and I think we should look back in a sense at what has worked in the past for us, and we should think about how we sustain innovation going forward and balance these risks and benefits of entanglement or interdependence in a highly globalized world in which our innovation ecosystems can be quite connected in ways that are both positive and negative. And I think also for the U.S. and Australia and for like-minded democracies that are concerned about the ethics of AI and some of its potential abuses, including currently and I think increasingly by the Chinese government in the case of censorship and surveillance. I think there are reasons also to think about how we can assert a more positive agenda about what AI for good can look like, what ethical uses of AI, including in a military context, would be, and how we push forward on norms and standards and collaboration, including within alliance frameworks, to really take full advantage of the positive potential of these technologies going forward. So a lot more in all three reports, but I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation, and it's wonderful to be here.
And what do you do about current problematic partnerships? I mean, if you're the Australian government and you look around at our university system and you raise a number of examples in your report, and the UTSC DC multi-year, quite heavy, I think it's $20 million over a few years partnership is a good example of it already exists. It's a defence state-owned enterprise that works very closely with the PLA. And it's sort of in year 2 or 3, I think, of its partnership. So it's probably not going anywhere. So if you were a policy advisor up in Parliament to, let's say, our Defence Minister or our Prime Minister, what do you do about a partnership like that? Or there's a couple others around Australia that are already very entrenched.
It's a difficult question, and certainly that particular partnership does seem to be uniquely problematic, given that CETC is a critical player in the Chinese defense industry. It's a state-owned enterprise. It's working on everything from quantum radar to swarm intelligence to military command information systems, and certainly, given how closely it is tied to the military, and certainly its funding of research in Australia and its engagement in this partnership, I think, should raise some red flags. And I think in terms of responses, I'd be curious, and I'm not sure if there are answers out there about what the terms of that arrangement are, who controls the results of that research, who has access to the data, what are the parameters within which intellectual property resulting from that research will be handled. Will it be under Australian law or Chinese law and policy, which in some cases, as Sam's research has shown, can be applied with some extraterritoriality, or can sort of be on in more expansive and extensive and often fairly opaque ways that can sometimes. Certainly, I think I'll leave it to Australian policymakers and the ongoing debate here as to whether that should be curtailed or whether restrictions should be put in place. But I think certainly there are clear risks here, particularly when you're talking about an entity that is so closely linked to defense research in China and to the Chinese military. And I think certainly looking at how best to handle that particular instance, given its nature, while also sustaining cooperation that can be mutually beneficial in technologies and in fields that are less sensitive or less clearly raise this dual use dilemma. So certainly a lot more to discuss here, but I'll leave it at that.
Please thank our 3 speakers this evening.